So hello and welcome to a Valorant meta-analysis video, the first one in 2022. Hope you've all had a good start to the year, and today we're going to be talking about what I assume will be an upcoming balance patch in the next patch for Valorant, and we're going to be looking at the different agents and how they might tweak them. Today we're going to be focusing on agents that need a nerf, and tomorrow we'll be focusing on the agents that could use a buff, and we'll talk about just how we might go about doing those kind of things. But the first thing I wanted to sort of bring your attention to is the percentage pick rate of each agent in Valorant Masters. Yoru actually isn't on here. You know, he's off to the side here at 0%. You'll be surprised. And Chamber wasn't allowed, but I think we can all agree that it's unlikely that Chamber is going to change much at all. I wouldn't really expect a buff or nerf one way or another for the new agent. So with that said, let's take a look at these agents and how we might think about changing them in one way or another. So the first thing to do, of course, is to identify, well, which agents need a nerf, and we will be focusing on the nerf portion today, and that obviously brings up, well, you're probably going to nerf the ones with the highest pick rates. Now, I don't have the data for, agent pick rates in ranked at this current time. I'm sure Riot does, and I'm sure that will come into their decision-making as well about, what gets balanced and what not. I don't have that data, so I can't, give an opinion on that, but I can assume some things. Certain agents like Sage and Reyna will probably have a much higher pick rate in ranked, I would expect, than they do here in for the pro scene at least, and that's because they're pretty simple agents to play, and generally people will play the simpler agents if they can, because they're easier to master. Whereas a character like Astra, who is very difficult to master, will probably have a much lower ranked pick rate than she does here at the pro level. So, which agents actually need a nerf? Well, for me, there's basically only 4, and we're in kind of a weird state, actually, where I think there isn't many agents you need to nerf. There's a couple agents who I think are in a good spot, and there is quite a lot of agents, actually, that you can buff in one way or another. I think there's a lot of potential for slight buffs to be given to a lot of different agents that will, help out. But we remember, when we're balancing any game, it's very difficult, because as soon as you press one button, 3 other buttons start flashing at you as a different problem. You have to be very careful. If you nerf Jett, then, all the other duelists get a bit better. And so if you buff another duelist as well, you have to be careful that, you haven't just replaced Jett with another duelist who now is just the dominant duelist. You have to be very careful about these things and think about, every single thing you do and how that's going to impact all the other agents as well. But with that said, let's look at the agents that need a nerf, and to me it is Jett, Sova, Astra, and Viper are the only ones up for consideration, I think. I think all the other agents are either perfectly fine or actually need a buff. I think that those are the only 4 agents that you would actually even consider nerfing, and they're the only agents that had an above 50% pick rate in the tournament, which I think is probably a fair barrier as consideration for nerfs. Now, the first of these agents, Jett, 82% pick rate is simply absurd. And what I will say is you shouldn't focus too much on the individual maps. It's perfectly fine, in my opinion, for an agent to have 100% on some maps. Let's take Viper's spread here, for instance. So she's pretty much 100% on 3 maps, 50 on some and 0 on others. That, I think, is actually a healthy state for the game, where if I was making this game, I wouldn't mind if agents were, a certainty on some maps, if their utility was good on the map, i.e. Viper on Breeze, but weren't as good on other maps, and there were better options on other maps. I don't care if they're 100% on one map. If I was part of the Valorant team, I wouldn't be looking at, everyone, 50% or less on every single map. I don't care. So I wouldn't worry about the individual numbers of each map too much. I would just be focusing really on the overall pick rate. And 82 for Jett is, of course, an absurd number, and is very clear that Jett needs a nerf. So, as I'm sure many of you know, Jett's main problem, or most people's problem with Jett, will be something like this. The fact that Jett can do that, and particularly in combination with an operator, right? Jett is Chamber now also you could potentially put in there as well. But Jett, for a long time has just been this agent that can pretty much get out of any situation for free, no matter what. Whether you hit the shot, whether you miss the shot, doesn't matter. The dash will save you. And I'm pretty sure most of you would agree that the dash is the problem. And, I've seen a lot of games do this, where they'll have an overpowered agent, but they really want to focus on whatever that thing is is kind of core to that character or that concept, whatever is going on. And so they don't really want to change it. And so they try and change the other things instead. And it just doesn't work. And the thing just stays completely overpowered, because what's keeping them overpowered is the thing that is fundamental to their character, right? And for Jet, that is her dash. Now, how on earth are we going to go about fixing her dash? Well, one suggestion, and there's been many, of how to fix Jet, but one suggestion I personally am the biggest fan of is that Jet's dash, Jet can only dash in the way that she is facing. Now, what that would mean is that clips like this that CNED just got aren't that easy. They're still possible, but they aren't nearly as easy, particularly with an operator, because that would mean you have to zoom out, you then have to look the right way, and then dash. Now, this for me is more important, and it's, we had that weird bug a while back now where, Jet would pull out her gun slower. I actually don't like that, because I think that people should be using Jet as an entry tool. You throw down a Jet smoke, you dash into it, and you go from there. That should still be a thing that Jet is able to do. She's a duelist. She's meant to create space. That's kind of the whole point, right? So I don't want to change it to where she gets her gun out slower so that she's worse at attack but still very good at defense. I want it to be the opposite way around, where she isn't as good on defense, but she's still very good on attack. And so by only being able to dash the way that you're facing, obviously when you're entering a site and you're attacking, that's fine. That it won't affect you at all, because you'll be facing the way you want to dash anyway. But when you're, operating, you're opping, or you're trying to get out of a bad fight that you've lost, you'll have to turn first and then dash, which, will give the opponent a bit more time to be able to kill you. And I would see this as just bringing Jet to a similar level to Raze. If you think about trying to avoid a fight with Raze after you've missed a shot and having to satchel and then bounce away, I still think that turning and dashing will be quicker and easier than that. So I actually think it would just bring Jet in line with Raze. And maybe you see this as such a big nerf that, you bring back Jet's third smoke. I don't think people would have a problem with that, to be honest. And I think that this change would just fundamentally fix Jet from being a character that can do, kind of things that others simply can't, to a character that is just more in line with the other duelists. Next up, we have Sova at 68%, and Sova is kind of a weird one, because I think a large portion of why Sova is picked so highly is because he's just so different than every other agent. All of his abilities, well, not all of them, but a large portion of his abilities are of course due to with information gathering and knowing exactly where someone is on the map, and that's just not something other initiators do that well. Sky kind of does it a bit, but and KO does it a bit, but nowhere near as well as Sova does. And so I think because he's so unique, that is partly why he has such a high pick rate in general. But I do also think that, we could potentially nerf Sova a bit to give those other initiators a bit more of a chance. I wouldn't be looking at a big nerf here at all. It wouldn't be something fundamental like Jet. What we could do is just decrease the time of things like the Owl drone. Decrease the time that it actually flies. I think it's 10 seconds. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think it's 10 seconds. You can just reduce that by a couple seconds, and I think that that would be fine. Just a very slight, small nerf, a slight time difference, and I think that that would make, Sova in a good spot. Next up, we have Astra and Viper, and this is it. There really isn't much to be talking about in terms of nerfs in general. I think aside from Jet, the game is in a pretty healthy place in terms of, agent pick rates, but we can talk about Astra and Viper, and I think the devs have mentioned this themselves, actually, that they think that Astra and Viper are in a good space, and that Brimstone and Omen aren't in a good space, and that instead they'll probably be looking to bring up those latter two rather than nerf the first two. And that is something I personally agree with. I think of all the agents, probably from Astra to Sage, maybe you wouldn't include Sage in it, maybe you would, but definitely these four here are in a very good spot. I actually think that these four agents are in the perfect spot in terms of their balance. And the reason that I think that is, they are rewarding if you play them well. Their abilities all make sense. They all do something. They are, if you play it well, you will get rewarded for playing them well. That is where you want an agent to be, I think. And so I actually think, despite Astra and Viper having a higher than 50% pick rate, I think a lot of that is actually to do with the fact that Brimstone and Omen are, some of the weakest agents in the game. I think, if Omen was better, for instance, he'd probably eat into, some of Astra's pick rates on maps like maybe Split. We saw Ascend run Omen on Split. Maybe on Split, Omen would become slightly better than Astra. Maybe on maps like Ascent, Omen used to see a lot of play. Maybe he'd come back onto Ascent. You know, Fracture, maybe Brimstone would start to see play on Fracture. Bind is definitely feels like a map that Brimstone with a buff could become better on. All those things, you know, I think really coalesce to where these agents don't actually need nerfing themselves. They're actually in a pretty good spot. But it's just that the other agents that you are your other options just are nowhere near as good, so that's why most teams don't run them. But if we were going to talk about nerfs for them, you know, if you put a gun to my head and say, no, nerf them now, what would I do? Well, it probably comes down to Astra for cooldown times, you know, and just increasing them slightly. I think that that's, you know, a pretty fair way of changing Astra. And for Viper, you know, again, it's probably just a slight numbers tweak on maybe the decay or something like that. I don't think that either of these agents deserve big nerfs, even if you really did want to nerf them. I think you'd be looking at, like, you know, minimally touching them as much as you could. But really, I'd probably be looking more at Brimstone and Omen and trying to buff them instead. And so that is it for agents that I think need to be nerfed in some way. Tomorrow we'll be talking about agents that need to be buffed, and there's, I think, a lot more there that we can kind of go into and talk about with some of these agents. Obviously, we know that the Yoru rework is coming, so I won't really talk about Yoru that much because, you know, they're going to rework him. We already know that. So I'm not going to talk about that one too much, but there's a lot of agents to go through, and I'll probably be talking about, you know, Cypher on down, about different ways that we can, you know, just, I mean, for some of them, it'll be obviously very slight buffs. For others, it will be quite significant buffs, you know, these ones down at the bottom here. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'd love to know what you think as well. Which agents need a nerf? How would you change them? I know the Jet one is obviously going to be up to your personal preference, whatever you think, you know, Jet needs nerfing in some way or another. But I'd love to know what you think in the comments down below, so please let me know. And with that, have a very nice day.